On the morning of January 28, 1839, James and Ruth Thornton carried their 3 children through chest-deep snow to their nearest neighbors, traveling 2 miles in conditions that should have made the journey impossible because the children had been sleeping for 4 days and would not wake despite every attempt their parents made to rouse them. The children were breathing, their hearts were beating, but they remained in a sleep so profound that shaking them, shouting at them, even inflicting pain produced no response beyond slight movements that suggested the stimuli registered somewhere, but not enough to bring them to consciousness. The Thorntons fled because the snow had been rising steadily for those same 4 days. The cabin was being buried progressively deeper and continuing to wait for the children to wake naturally. While the snow rose around them felt like accepting burial alive. Carrying sleeping children through a blizzard seemed preferable to remaining in a cabin that was filling with snow while the children slept through the crisis that should have woken anyone capable of waking. Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing confluences of natural phenomenon and physiological mystery ever documented in the Ozark Plateau. In the years when winter storms could last for days, and when snow accumulation created conditions where survival required constant vigilance and constant action, when sleeping through crisis meant death because crisis would not wait for convenient waking, when children were expected to rouse at the first sign of danger, the way all living things rouse when survival requires it, there lived a family whose children fell into sleep that would not end despite conditions that should have made sleep impossible, despite accumulating snow that threatened burial, and despite parents' increasingly desperate attempts to force waking through methods that should have roused anyone who could be roused. Leave a comment where you're watching from as we trace the line between natural sleep and pathological unconsciousness, between rest and the kind of withdrawal from which return becomes uncertain. This video is a work of fiction created solely for entertainment purposes. Any resemblance to actual persons, living or dead, is purely coincidental. Before we enter that cabin and watch parents try desperately to wake children who will not wake while snow rises toward the roof, consider what sleep meant on the frontier and why abnormal sleep patterns were understood to be symptoms of serious illness or injury that required immediate intervention. Sleep was recognized as necessary for health, but also as vulnerability, as a state during which threats could arrive undetected, and during which the sleeper was defenseless against dangers that waking persons could address. Frontier families learned to sleep lightly, to wake at unusual sounds, to rouse quickly when circumstances changed, because survival often depended on recognizing threats immediately and responding before those threats could cause harm. Children particularly were expected to wake readily, to respond to parents' calls, to transition from sleep to waking within seconds when emergency required it. A child who slept so deeply that they could not be easily woken was cause for concern, was potential evidence of fever or head injury, or some other medical crisis that was suppressing normal arousal mechanisms. A child who could not be woken at all, who remained unconscious despite shaking and shouting in pain, was in serious danger, was experiencing something that transcended normal sleep and that might indicate brain injury or poisoning or some other condition that threatened life if not addressed immediately. The Thornton family, James, age 34, Ruth, age 32, and their 3 children, Mary, age 9, Samuel, age 6, and Anna, age 4, had lived on their homestead in the Ozark Plateau, approximately 12 miles southwest of what would eventually become Springfield, Missouri, since 1836. They had survived 2 previous winters without unusual difficulty, and were considered by the sparse community of neighbors to be a capable family who managed their property adequately and who showed the resilience that frontier life required. The children were healthy, were developing normally, and showed no signs of the chronic illnesses or developmental problems that made some children unsuited for the hardships of frontier existence. The winter of 1838-1839 had been severe by the standards of the region, with heavy snows beginning in December and with the temperatures that remained consistently below freezing for weeks at a time. But severe winters were not unprecedented, and the Thornton family had prepared appropriately, gathering firewood, storing food, making the cabin as weatherproof as possible, and settling into the routines of winter confinement that previous experience had taught them to expect and to endure. The storm that would create the crisis began on January 24th, with snow that fell steadily from the start, accumulating at perhaps an inch per hour and creating within the first day conditions where travel outside the immediate vicinity of the cabin was inadvisable and where the family understood they would be confined until the storm ended, however long that took. The first day of the storm passed without unusual incident. The family maintained fire, ate normally, and engaged in the quiet activities that winter confinement required, waiting for the storm to end as storms always eventually ended. But on the evening of January 24th, Ruth noticed that the children seemed unusually tired, that they were becoming drowsy earlier than normal, and that when she put them to bed, they fell asleep almost immediately, with a depth of sleep that seemed different from their normal sleep patterns. Children normally moved during sleep, changed positions, made small sounds, responded to noises or to movements nearby with slight alterations in breathing or position that indicated their sleep was not complete unconsciousness, but rather a lighter state from which they could transition to waking if circumstances required. But the children that night seemed to pass directly into deep sleep from which they did not move, did not make sounds, and from which normal nighttime stimuli, sounds of parents moving, light from the fire, temperature changes, did not produce any response. Ruth mentioned this to James, noting that the children's sleep seemed unusually deep, but attributing it to exhaustion from the previous day's activities, or perhaps to the particular quality of rest that people sometimes experienced during heavy snowfall, when the outside world became very quiet, and when the cabin's interior took on the hushed quality that deep snow created by absorbing sound. James agreed that the children seemed to be sleeping deeply, but did not see cause for immediate concern. Children slept heavily sometimes, particularly when they were growing or when they had been particularly active, and the depth of sleep was likely temporary and would normalize by morning. But morning came, January 25th, and the children did not wake at their normal time. Ruth went to check on them and found them still asleep in the positions they had assumed when going to bed the previous evening, their breathing slow and regular, their faces peaceful, showing no signs of the gradual transition toward waking that normally occurred in the hours before children actually opened their eyes and began moving. Ruth tried to wake them gently, speaking their names and touching their shoulders, expecting them to rouse easily the way children normally roused when parents indicated it was time to wake. But the children did not wake. Mary stirred slightly at the touch, but did not open her eyes or show signs of consciousness. Samuel's breathing changed slightly when Ruth shook his shoulder, but he remained asleep. Anna did not respond at all to gentle stimuli, remained motionless and deeply asleep despite Ruth's increasingly firm attempts to rouse her. James came to help, and together the parents tried more aggressive methods, shaking the children more vigorously, speaking loudly, removing blankets to expose them to the cooler air that should have prompted waking. These efforts produced minimal response. The children would occasionally move slightly, or make small sounds that suggested they were not completely unreachable, but they did not wake, did not open their eyes, did not transition to the conscious state that the stimuli should have produced. Ruth and James became seriously concerned. They checked the children for fever, for signs of illness, for any physical indication of what might be causing the abnormal sleep. The children's skin was cool, their pulses were regular, their breathing was unlabored. They showed none of the signs of fever or respiratory distress that might explain unconsciousness. They appeared to be simply sleeping, but sleeping in a way that was not responsive to normal waking stimuli, and that was persisting far beyond the normal duration of night sleep. By midday on January 25th, the children had been asleep for approximately 18 hours, far exceeding normal sleep duration for children their ages. The snow continued to fall heavily, had accumulated to perhaps 3 feet on level ground, and showed no signs of moderating. James and Ruth tried repeatedly to wake the children, using increasingly aggressive methods, pinching them, shouting directly into their ears, even slapping their faces gently. But these efforts produced only minimal responses and did not bring the children to consciousness. The parents faced a crisis that had no obvious solution. The children needed medical attention, needed a doctor to examine them, and to determine what was causing the abnormal sleep and how it could be treated. But the nearest doctor was in Springfield, 12 miles distant, and travel through the ongoing storm and through 3 feet of snow was impossible. James could not leave the family to seek help, and even if he could make the journey, bringing a doctor back through the same conditions was unlikely to be achievable before the children's condition either improved or deteriorated, to the point where intervention would be too late. The only option was to continue attempting to wake the children, to monitor their condition carefully, and to hope that whatever was causing the deep sleep would resolve naturally, and that the children would wake on their own before their extended unconsciousness created secondary problems like dehydration or the aspiration of saliva or other complications that prolonged unconsciousness could create. Through the afternoon and evening of January 25th, Ruth and James took turns sitting with the children, trying periodically to wake them, checking their breathing and their pulses, and attempting to understand what could cause 3 healthy children to fall into sleep from which they could not be roused, despite increasingly desperate efforts to force waking. The children remained in the same deep sleep, moved occasionally but did not wake, breathed regularly but did not respond to stimuli that should have produced consciousness. By the morning of January 26th, the children's second full day of continuous sleep, the storm had not moderated, and the snow had accumulated to approximately 4 feet on level ground, with drifts significantly deeper. The cabin was beginning to show signs of the accumulation's impact. The lower portions of the windows were buried. The door was becoming difficult to open against the snow that was piling against it, and the interior was darker than it should have been during daylight hours, because the windows were being progressively obscured by snow that was rising up the exterior walls. James attempted to clear snow from around the cabin to maintain access to the door and to the woodshed where firewood was stored, but the ongoing snowfall replaced whatever he cleared within hours, and the physical effort required to shovel 4 feet of snow was exhausting in ways that made sustained clearing impossible. He could maintain minimal access to essential areas, but he could not prevent the progressive burial of the cabin under accumulation that showed no signs of ending. Inside, Ruth continued her attempts to wake the children. She tried different approaches, speaking to them about things they cared about, singing songs they knew, telling them that they needed to wake up because Mother needed their help. She tried feeding them small amounts of water by dribbling it into their mouths, trying to trigger the swallowing reflex and hoping that the sensation of liquid would produce waking response. The children would swallow reflexively when water touched their throats, demonstrating that some automatic functions were working, but they did not wake, did not show any sign of consciousness despite Ruth's increasingly desperate efforts. By the evening of January 26th, the children had been asleep for approximately 48 hours. This duration of continuous sleep was far beyond anything that could be considered normal, was clearly evidence of some pathological state rather than merely deep rest, and was creating additional concerns about how long children could remain unconscious without suffering permanent damage to brain function or to other systems that required periodic waking to function properly. The storm continued through January 27th without abating. The snow accumulation reached approximately 5 feet on level ground, and the cabin was now buried to the point where the roof was the only portion that remained clearly above the surrounding snow level. The windows were completely obscured, the door could barely be opened, and the interior of the cabin was becoming progressively darker as the snow rose higher on the exterior walls and blocked the light that normally would have entered through windows and gaps. James and Ruth were now facing compound crisis. The children remained unconscious despite 3 days of continuous sleep, and despite every method the parents could devise to force waking. The cabin was being buried under snow that showed no signs of stopping, and the parents themselves were becoming exhausted from the combination of constant vigilance over the children, the physical effort of maintaining the cabin and managing the snow, and the psychological stress of watching their children sleep through a crisis that should have woken anyone capable of waking. Ruth began to fear that the children had fallen into some kind of coma, that whatever had caused the deep sleep had progressed to a state from which they might not return, that they would remain unconscious indefinitely, and that watching them breathe while being unable to wake them would become the new, permanent reality. James tried to provide reassurance, tried to maintain hope that the children would wake naturally, once whatever was affecting them had run its course. But he too was beginning to doubt whether natural waking would occur or whether the children had passed into a state that required medical intervention they could not provide and could not access. By the morning of January 28th, the children's 4th full day of sleep, the situation had become untenable. The snow had accumulated to approximately 6 feet on level ground. The cabin was buried except for the roof and the top portions of the walls, and the interior was so dark that it required constant lamplight even during what should have been daylight hours. The children remained deeply asleep, had now been unconscious for approximately 96 hours, and showed no signs of waking despite Ruth's unceasing attempts to rouse them through every method she could imagine. James and Ruth made the decision that they could not remain in the cabin waiting for the children to wake while the snow continued to rise and while burial became increasingly likely. If they stayed, they risked being trapped completely when the snow reached the roof level and when escape would become impossible. If they left, they would have to carry 3 unconscious children through 6 feet of snow in ongoing storm conditions, but at least they would be moving toward potential help rather than remaining stationary while crisis accumulated around them. What Sarah Patterson understood when she opened her cabin door on the afternoon of January 28th to find James Thornton standing in chest-deep snow, carrying a child in his arms with 2 more children being dragged on a makeshift sled behind him, and with Ruth Thornton struggling through the snow behind the sled, was that something had gone catastrophically wrong for the family to attempt travel in these conditions. The Pattersons lived approximately 2 miles from the Thornton homestead, and those 2 miles through 6 feet of snow with 3 children should have been impossible. The fact that the Thorntons had made the journey indicated desperation beyond what weather alone would create. Sarah called for her husband William, and together they helped the Thornton family into the cabin, getting them near the fire and checking the children who James and Ruth explained had been sleeping for 4 days and could not be woken despite every attempt their parents had made. William examined the children carefully, checking for signs of illness or injury, looking for any obvious cause of the prolonged unconsciousness. The children appeared healthy apart from the sleep itself. Their breathing was regular, their pulses were strong, their skin color was good, and they showed none of the signs that would typically accompany unconsciousness caused by illness or trauma. They looked like children sleeping peacefully, except that they had been sleeping for 4 days and could not be roused. William tried his own attempts to wake the children, using methods similar to what James and Ruth had already tried: loud noises, physical stimulation, even mild pain, but achieved the same minimal results. The children would stir slightly, would sometimes make small sounds or movements, but would not wake, would not open their eyes, would not transition to consciousness. Sarah suggested that perhaps the children were not in danger, that perhaps this was some unusual but not harmful sleep state that would resolve naturally, and that the Thorntons' desperation came more from fear of what the sleep might mean than from any actual evidence that the children were in crisis. But Ruth explained that she had been monitoring the children constantly for 4 days, that she had tried everything to wake them, and that the combination of the children's continued unconsciousness and the rising snow that was burying their cabin had created a situation where remaining at their homestead had felt like waiting for burial. Carrying the children through snow had seemed less dangerous than staying in a cabin that was being progressively filled with snow while the children slept through the crisis. William agreed that the Thornton family should remain with the Pattersons until the storm ended and until the children's condition changed, that attempting to return to their homestead in current conditions would be dangerous, and that at minimum the children needed to be in a location where they could be monitored by multiple adults and where help could be sought more easily if their condition deteriorated. The storm continued through January 28th and into the 29th, finally beginning to moderate on the morning of January 30th. The children remained asleep through this entire period. 5 days of continuous unconsciousness that was far beyond anything that medical knowledge of the time could explain as normal sleep or as any recognized medical condition. They continued to breathe regularly. Their hearts continued to beat strongly. But they did not wake, did not respond to stimuli, and remained in the profound sleep that had persisted since the evening of January 24th. And then, on the afternoon of January 30th, as the storm finally cleared and as weak sunlight began to penetrate the cabin windows for the first time in days, Mary stirred, opened her eyes, and looked around with the confusion of someone waking from ordinary sleep who was disoriented by unfamiliar surroundings. Within minutes, Samuel also woke, and shortly after him, Anna woke, all 3 children transitioning from unconsciousness to consciousness within the span of perhaps half an hour. The children appeared normal upon waking. They were hungry, they were thirsty, they were somewhat disoriented by being in the Patterson cabin rather than their own home, but they showed no signs of the neurological damage or the physical deterioration that 5 days of continuous unconsciousness should have produced. They did not remember falling asleep, had no awareness that time had passed, and from their perspective, they had simply gone to bed one evening and woken up shortly afterward in a different location with their parents looking exhausted and frightened. Ruth and James tried to explain what had happened, but the children could not understand or could not believe that they had been asleep for 5 days, that their parents had tried desperately to wake them, or that the family had fled their cabin through a blizzard because the children would not rouse, while snow rose toward the roof. The children had no explanation for why they had slept so long, or why they could not be woken. From their internal experience, nothing unusual had occurred. They had simply slept normally and had woken normally. And the distress their parents showed seemed disproportionate to what they perceived as ordinary sleep. Medical examination of the children over the following days, once travel became possible and a doctor could be brought from Springfield, revealed no obvious cause for the prolonged sleep. The children were healthy, showed no signs of head injury or of ingestion of substances that might have caused unconsciousness, and demonstrated no neurological deficits that would indicate brain damage from the extended period without waking. The doctor had no explanation. 5 days of natural sleep was unprecedented. The fact that all 3 children had fallen into deep sleep simultaneously suggested some environmental factor, but what environmental factor could cause such sleep remained mysterious. Theories were proposed. Poisoning from food or stove fumes, altered air from the buried cabin, creating unusual sleep states, even some hibernation-like response to cold and darkness. But none explained why the parents were unaffected, why the children showed no other symptoms, or why they woke completely healthy. The most disturbing possibility was that the children's sleep had no clear cause, that it might occur again without warning, and that medical knowledge had no framework to prevent or treat it. The Thornton family did not return to their homestead. When James traveled back to the property after the storm cleared, he found the cabin buried to its roof line under 6 feet of compacted snow. The interior dark and cold and filled with snow that had entered through gaps and through the chimney, and the structure damaged by the weight of accumulation in ways that would require extensive repair before it could be habitable again. The family made the decision to relocate to a different area, to establish a new homestead in a location that was less isolated and where winter storms would not create the kind of complete confinement that their previous location had created. The children grew to adulthood without experiencing any recurrence of the prolonged sleep and without showing any lasting effects from their 5 days of unconsciousness. They had no memory of the event beyond what their parents told them, had no explanation for why it had occurred, and lived normal lives that gave no indication that they had once slept through a crisis that should have woken anyone capable of waking, that had persisted through their parents' desperate attempts to rouse them, and that had finally ended as mysteriously as it had begun, transitioning from unconsciousness to consciousness without warning, without obvious cause, and without any clear understanding of what had caused the sleep or what had finally allowed it to end. We have reached the end of this journey through one of the Ozark Plateau's most disturbing confluences of natural phenomenon and physiological mystery. Children who fell into sleep from which they could not be woken, who remained unconscious for 5 days while snow rose toward the roof of their cabin, and who finally woke as mysteriously as they had fallen asleep, with no explanation for what had caused their prolonged unconsciousness, or why it had ended when it did, leaving only the memory of parents carrying sleeping children through chest-deep snow, because remaining in a cabin being buried under accumulation while children slept through the crisis that should have woken them felt more dangerous than attempting a journey that should have been impossible. If you've made it this far on this journey through territory where sleep becomes pathological and where snow creates burial while children rest unconscious, consider subscribing to Commute Tales for more stories that explore the boundaries between normal physiology and mysterious dysfunction. Leave a comment sharing your thoughts on what might have caused the children's prolonged sleep. And if this story resonated with you, A-Like helps bring these narratives to more people. Until our next journey, remember that somewhere in the Ozark Plateau, a family once carried their children through 6 feet of snow, because those children had been sleeping for 5 days and would not wake, and that those children finally woke when the storm cleared with no explanation for what had caused it or what had finally allowed it to end.